Our 20th anniversary dinner sat untouched between us, candlelight flickering across the expensive china I'd selected so carefully. "I want a divorce," Richard said, his voice eerily calm as he straightened his designer tie. "Caroline and I have been discussing this for months. She understands my vision for the future in ways you never have." Caroline, his executive assistant of just 14 months. The woman who'd been sending me exquisite flower arrangements for my home office with little notes about how much "we all appreciate everything you do." I sat perfectly still, my champagne flute frozen halfway to my lips, watching my husband, of 20 years, dismantle our life with corporate efficiency. "There's no easy way to say this," Richard continued, pulling a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. "I've had my legal team prepare everything. We can make this simple if you cooperate. I'm prepared to be generous, but the business remains with me, of course. It's always been mine." The restaurant's ambient noise faded to a distant hum as blood rushed through my ears. The sapphire engagement ring he'd insisted I upgrade for our 15th anniversary felt suddenly heavy on my finger. 20 years of marriage. 15 years building Meridian Technologies together. 3 children whose university tuition payments were scheduled to leave our joint account next week. "You're leaving me for Caroline?" I finally managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Richard had the audacity to look annoyed, glancing at his watch, the vintage Patek Philippe I'd given him when we secured our first major investor. "Let's not be dramatic, Julia. These things happen. People grow apart. Caroline simply helped me realize it was time for a change." He pushed the envelope toward me. "Everything's outlined clearly. The penthouse goes to me, but you can have the beach house in Malibu. It needs renovation anyway. You always enjoyed your little redesign projects." Little redesign projects, like the complete rebranding of Meridian Technologies 5 years ago that had doubled our market share. Like the office complex I'd designed from the ground up when we expanded to international markets. Like the life I'd built alongside this man while putting my own architecture career on hold. "How thoughtful," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "And when exactly were you planning to inform our children that you're leaving their mother for your 29-year-old assistant?" Richard's jaw tightened, the same expression he wore when a board meeting wasn't proceeding according to his agenda. "I thought we might tell them together next weekend. Keep things civil. Caroline suggested a family dinner might make the transition easier." "Caroline seems to have thought of everything." "She's quite insightful," he agreed, completely missing the venom in my tone. "Very organized. She's already found us a place in the city. Better access to the office. I'm sure that's convenient for both of you." My mind raced through the signs I'd ignored over the past year, the late-night strategy sessions, the sudden business trips to cities where we had no clients, the way Caroline always seemed to know details about our home she shouldn't have known. Like how she'd commented on our wine cellar reorganization when she'd never been to our house, or how she'd mentioned our new bedroom paint color during the holiday party. "The terms are more than fair," Richard continued, tapping the envelope with his manicured finger. "You'll have enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. Nothing extravagant. But you've never been one for showing off anyway." I reached for my water glass instead of the tempting wine, needing clarity. "And the business. As I said, Meridian stays with me. I founded it. I've run it since day one." I permitted myself the smallest of smiles. "Did Caroline help you prepare these documents too?" "My legal team handled everything, but yes, Caroline helped organize the details. She has quite a head for business matters." He checked his watch again. "I have a call with Tokyo in an hour. If you could look these over tonight, we can meet with the attorneys tomorrow." "On our anniversary," I said flatly. He had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "The timing is unfortunate, I admit, but there's no reason to delay the inevitable." I finally reached for the envelope, not opening it but running my fingers along the sealed edge. "And if I contested these terms?" Richard's expression hardened. That would be unwise, Julia. A lengthy legal battle benefits no one. I've built this company from nothing. Any judge would recognize that. You've built it from nothing, I repeated, each word carefully measured. Is that what you genuinely believe? It's not a belief, it's fact. You've played your part, and I'm acknowledging that with a very generous settlement. Caroline thought we should offer less, but I insisted. How magnanimous. I stood, gathering my purse. Excuse me for a moment. Where are you going? We haven't discussed. Powder room? I interrupted. Unless Caroline has opinions about that. 2? I walked through the restaurant on autopilot, nodding to the maitre d' who knew us as regulars. The Carlyle had been Richard's choice tonight, the same restaurant where he'd proposed 20 years ago. Now I understood the theatrical symmetry he'd orchestrated. A perfect circle, begin and end in the same prestigious location. Richard always did have a flair for what he called narrative control. The bathroom was empty, its marble countertops gleaming under soft lighting. I placed my hands on the cool surface, finally allowing myself to feel the tremors I'd suppressed at the table. My reflection showed a woman I barely recognized, still put together in her carefully selected anniversary dress, but with eyes that had aged decades in minutes. I pulled out my phone, my finger hovering over my best friend Madeline's number before switching to my attorney's contact instead. Victor Chen had handled my personal legal matters for years, kept separate from Richard's legal team at my insistence. A boundary Richard had once called unnecessarily cautious, and now struck me as providential. The text was brief. Emergency. Richard asking for divorce. Claims business is solely his. Need urgent meeting tomorrow morning. Victor's response came almost immediately. 8 a.m. my office. Bring any documentation you have. Don't sign anything. My mind raced through the contents of my home office safe. The original business formation documents, the investment records, the handwritten agreements from before we could afford attorneys. The evidence of what Richard seemed determined to erase. My foundational role in creating and building Meridian. Another text arrived, this one from my sister Elena. How's the anniversary dinner? Did he love the watch? The custom watch I'd had engraved with our wedding date and the coordinates of where we'd met remained in my purse, suddenly transformed from anniversary gift to relic of a shared history Richard was eager to discard. Took a deep breath, splashed cold water on my wrists, an old trick my grandmother taught me for steadying nerves, and reapplied my lipstick. The woman in the mirror straightened her shoulders. Richard might control the narrative he was creating with Caroline, but he had forgotten who helped write the original story of Meridian Technologies. As I returned to our table, I noticed Richard was on his phone, his expression animated in a way it rarely was with me anymore. He ended the call abruptly when he saw me approaching. Caroline, I said. Not a question. Just confirming my Tokyo call. He lied smoothly. Have you had a chance to think about what I've proposed? I reclaimed my seat, placing my napkin precisely across my lap. 20 years of marriage deserves more than 10 minutes of consideration, don't you think? Richard's impatience flickered across his face. Julia, we both know this marriage has been over for years. We've been going through the motions, staying together for appearances, for the children. Is that what we've been doing? I asked, genuinely curious about the revisionist history he'd constructed. And when exactly did you determine our marriage was beyond saving? Before or after you began sleeping with Caroline? His eyes narrowed. This isn't about Caroline. Isn't it? The timing seems rather specific. 14 months as your executive assistant, and suddenly she's essential to your vision of the future. She recognizes my contributions, Richard said, his voice lowering. My value. Do you know how long it's been since you've acknowledged anything I've accomplished at Meridian? I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Perhaps around the same time you stopped acknowledging that without my family's seed money, my architectural redesign of the manufacturing process, and my connections to the European markets, Meridian would still be a struggling startup operating out of our garage. Richard dismissed this with a wave of his hand. Ancient history. The company's success over the past decade has been driven by my leadership. Your leadership, I repeated. And what would the board say about your leadership if they knew about the Westlake acquisition documents you had Caroline alter before presentation? His confidence faltered momentarily. I don't know what you're talking about. The procurement costs you inflated to justify the higher purchase price. The same documents I found Caroline revising in your home office during the New Year's party. I assumed at the time she was simply following your instructions, not that she was your, what are we calling her? Your partner in all things. Richard's jaw tightened. You're making serious accusations without evidence. Am I? I sipped my water calmly. How interesting that your mind immediately went to evidence rather than denying the allegation itself. A muscle twitched in his cheek. His tell when cornered. I'd seen it across countless negotiation tables over the years. This is exactly why things haven't worked between us, he said. The constant suspicion, the undermining. Caroline supports my decisions. I'm sure she supports whatever serves her advancement, I replied, just as I'm sure the board would be, fascinated to learn how our newest executive assistant came to own shares in Meridian, normally reserved for senior leadership. Richard paled slightly. You've been investigating me? Not at all, I said truthfully. I simply read the quarterly ownership reports. It's my company too, after all. Something you'll need to prove, he countered, regaining his composure. The settlement I'm offering is more than fair considering the circumstances. I placed my napkin on the table and stood. I think we're finished here. You haven't opened the envelope, Richard said, gesturing to the documents. No need. I won't be signing anything tonight or tomorrow or the day after. I gathered my purse. Happy anniversary, Richard. I suggest you cancel your Tokyo call. You'll be too busy with your attorneys to make it. Before we jump back to my anniversary night confrontation, I want to thank all the amazing viewers who've been leaving comments and sharing your own stories of resilience. If you're tuning in for the first time, let me know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals how I uncovered the paper trail that changed everything. Now back to that fateful night. The valet retrieved my car with a sympathetic smile that made me wonder how my distress was manifesting physically. I'd always prided myself on composure, a necessary skill when you're often the only woman in rooms full of tech investors. Yet something in my expression must have betrayed the earthquake reshaping my internal landscape. Are you all right, Mrs. Mercer? He asked, handing me my keys. I managed a nod, though all right had never felt further from reality. The drive home became a blur of rain-slicked streets and automatic muscle memory. I'd made this journey countless times, from downtown to our Westlake mansion, the home I'd designed down to the last doorknob while Richard focused on more important matters. Our house blazed with lights I'd programmed to welcome us home after our anniversary celebration. The cleaning service had left flowers. Caroline's doing, no doubt, another thoughtful touch from the woman who'd been planning to replace me while arranging my household schedule. The irony wasn't lost on me. I moved through our foyer with purposeful steps, ignoring the anniversary decorations I'd set up that morning. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the climate control system I'd had custom designed for. Richard's wine collection. 20 years accumulated in 12,000 square feet of carefully curated space, and he'd offered me the beach house needing renovation as consolation. My home office remained locked, another boundary Richard had called paranoid. The retinal scanner admitted me to my private sanctuary, where framed architectural awards shared wall space with family photos and the original Meridian technologies. Blueprint sketches. I headed straight for the concealed safe behind a model of our first office building. Inside, organized with the precision Richard had once admired, lay the documentation of my life's work. I began sorting through folders, creating two piles, essential and peripheral. The founding documents went into the essential stack. Incorporation papers listing Richard Mercer and Julia Bennett Mercer as co-founders with equal 50% ownership. The initial business plan in my handwriting. Bank statements showing the $750,000 transfer from my trust fund that had provided our startup capital. My hands trembled slightly as I found the original napkin where we'd sketched our vision for Meridian, revolutionary, building automation technology that would transform commercial real estate. Richard's handwriting labeled the concept. Mine provided the technical specifications. We'd been equals then, before success had gradually distorted his recollection of our partnership. My phone vibrated with a text from Madeline. Anniversary dinner update? Did the reservation work out? Madeline had helped secure the private dining room at the Carlyle, calling in favors to create the perfect anniversary setting. Another well-intentioned contribution to an evening engineered for my humiliation. Dinner was illuminating, I replied. Need your help. Can you meet tomorrow? 10 a.m. at Victor's office. Her response was immediate. What happened? Are you okay? Richard is leaving. For Caroline. Claims business is his alone. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Finally, that backstabbing bastard. I'm coming over. No. Need to work. Tomorrow at Victor's. Bring coffee. Strong. I returned to my cataloging with renewed focus. The shareholding agreements. The patents. 7 with my name as lead inventor. 5 jointly held with Richard. 3 with his name alone, though I'd contributed significantly to their development. I'd let those pass at the time, thinking of us as a unit. Richard and Julia Mercer, partners in all things. How easily generosity becomes vulnerability when weaponized by someone you trust. A soft chime announced an email, Victor confirming our morning appointment and requesting any relevant documentation. I began scanning the most critical papers, encrypting and attaching them to a secure server only Victor and I could access. Richard had always delegated technical details to others. He wouldn't expect this level of preparation. The grandfather clock in the hallway, an anniversary gift from Richard's parents on our 5th year, chimed 11 as I finished the most essential scanning. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Richard, no voicemails, predictable. Richard never explained himself on recordings that could be referenced later. A text followed. Your dramatic exit was unnecessary. Where are you? I ignored it, continuing my methodical preparation. Another chime. Julia, be reasonable. The terms are generous. Check your emotions and think logically. The condescension ignited a fresh surge of determination. Richard had always weaponized the accusation of emotional thinking whenever I disagreed with him. An effective silencing tactic in our early years that had lost its power as I'd gained confidence. The front door opened and closed with the distinctive sound of Richard's arrival. His footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, hesitated, then headed toward his study rather than coming upstairs to find me. Another text lit up my phone. We'll discuss this in the morning when you're thinking clearly. I'm sleeping in the guest suite tonight. Of course he was. Caroline had probably been in our bed recently enough to make Richard uncomfortable with the proximity. I texted Madeline a final message. Bring Daniel too. We'll need forensic accounting. Daniel Thompson had been my brother's roommate at Stanford, and now headed one of the most respected financial investigation firms in the country. If Richard had been moving assets, and his confidence in claiming Meridian suggested he had, Daniel would find the trail. I secured the remaining documents in my safe, changed out of my anniversary dress into comfortable clothes, and settled at my desk with the family laptop. Richard always used his company computer for important matters, viewing our shared laptop as suitable only for household management and vacation planning. Another underestimation that would prove costly. Because while Richard saw me primarily as the architect-turned-housewife who'd helped start his company before focusing on raising his children, he'd forgotten that I'd maintained access to every system I'd helped design, including the encrypted backup server that automatically archived all executive-level communications. Morning arrived with the clinical precision of an appointment I couldn't reschedule. I'd slept perhaps 3 hours, curled in the chaise lounge in my office rather than returning to our bedroom. The house remained silent as I showered in the guest bathroom and dressed in what I thought of as my investor meeting outfit, a tailored charcoal suit that communicated authority without seeking attention. Richard's bedroom door remained closed as I passed. He'd always been a late riser when possible, claiming his best strategic thinking happened after 9 a.m., another luxury afforded by my early morning management of household logistics and children's schedules over the years. I gathered my prepared documents and the encrypted drive containing everything I'd discovered during my night of investigation. The contents would have been shocking if they hadn't confirmed suspicions that had been forming in my subconscious for months. Email threads between Richard and Caroline discussing ownership restructuring, calendar invitations to meetings with offshore banking representatives, preliminary incorporation paperwork for a new entity called Meridian Global, with only Richard listed as founder. The kitchen still bore evidence of the anniversary breakfast I'd prepared before Richard had claimed an early meeting, fresh flowers now wilting slightly, a card unopened beside his coffee cup. I left it all untouched, a domestic crime scene preserving evidence of my own naivety. My phone buzzed with a text from Victor, arrived early. Maddie and Daniel already here. Good. I needed my support system fully briefed before formulating our response strategy. As I collected my car keys, Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in one of his power suits, phone in hand. "You're up early," he observed. His tone casual, as if the previous night had been a minor disagreement rather than the detonation of our shared life. "I've moved the meeting with the attorneys to noon. Gives us time to discuss terms privately. First, I have a prior commitment," I replied, neither offering details nor meeting his gaze. Richard sighed with practiced patience. "Julia, avoiding this conversation won't change the situation. We need to handle this transition efficiently, for everyone's sake." Everyone meaning you and Caroline? That's unfair. Caroline is part of this situation, yes, but my decision about our marriage stands independently of my relationship with her. The practiced corporate phrasing, so careful to establish plausible deniability while admitting nothing specific, almost made me laugh. Almost. "Tell me, Richard, when did you first decide our marriage needed restructuring? Before or after you began restructuring Meridian's ownership?" His expression flickered with momentary surprise before settling back into controlled neutrality. "I don't know what you're implying." "No implications. Simple questions. When did you instruct your attorneys to draft incorporation documents for Meridian Global? When did you begin transferring patent ownership to the new shell company? When did you authorize Caroline to negotiate with Apex Ventures about acquiring your company?" With each question, Richard's carefully maintained composure deteriorated. By the final query, his face had paled significantly. "You've been in my office," he accused. "I didn't need to be. Executive communications are automatically backed up to the secure server I designed. The one you called Julia's unnecessary redundancy, but agreed to, because it satisfied the security requirements for the DoD contracts." Richard's expression hardened. "You've been spying on me. Reviewing company records as a co-founder and major shareholder," I corrected. "Exactly as outlined in Section 8.3 of our operating agreement. Those communications are privileged. Not. From other owners, they aren't, especially when they concern attempts to misappropriate company assets." I checked my watch. "I'm late for my meeting." Richard moved to block the doorway. Whatever you think you've discovered has been taken out of context. Caroline was helping me organize documents for a potential expansion, nothing more. Expansion that conveniently excluded me and reassigned intellectual property I developed? Interesting interpretation. I stepped around him. Your attorneys can explain their creative approach to fiduciary duty directly to my legal team. Your legal team? Richard's laugh held no humor. Victor handles your art purchases and charitable foundation, Julia. This is corporate law. You're out of your depth. You may find I'm precisely at my depth. I opened the front door. I'd wish you a productive day, but I suspect it's about to become rather complicated. The drive to Victor's downtown office provided necessary decompression time. Seattle's morning. Traffic required just enough attention to prevent complete absorption in the emotional hurricane gathering strength. Mount Rainier appeared briefly through clearing clouds. Solid, immovable, a geological reminder of permanence amid human chaos. Victor's corner office offered panoramic views of that same mountain, its presence a backdrop to the gathering of my emergency response team. Madeline stood as I entered, enveloping me in a fierce hug that temporarily cracked my professional veneer. That absolute bastard, she whispered. After everything you've built together. Daniel Thompson rose next, his accountant's precision evident in his pressed shirt and organized folio already open on Victor's conference table. Julia, I'm sorry about the circumstances, but we're going to get this sorted. Victor Chen, silver-haired and impeccably dressed even for an emergency Saturday meeting, gestured to the coffee service. We've been reviewing what you sent over. Preliminary assessment? Bad, Daniel finished. How bad? I asked, accepting the steaming cup Madeline pressed into my hands. Richard has been systematically creating a parallel corporate structure, Victor explained, transferring intellectual property, preparing new operating agreements, establishing independent banking relationships. He's been building a lifeboat, Daniel added. One designed specifically to exclude you from the value you helped create. Nodded, unsurprised yet still feeling the impact. And Caroline's role? Daniel tapped his tablet. Based on the communications you provided, she's been acting as his proxy in meetings you would typically attend, representing herself as having decision-making authority beyond her title. Apparently, executive assistant duties have expanded significantly since my day, Madeline muttered. Victor leaned forward. Julia, I need to ask, when did you first suspect something was wrong at Meridian? 2 months ago, I replied, settling into Victor's ergonomic chair. The quarterly investor report arrived with discrepancies in the R&D budget allocations. Projects I'd initiated had been deprioritized while receiving increased funding on paper. When I questioned Richard, he claimed it was a clerical error, but the corrections never appeared in subsequent documentation. Victor made notes in his precise handwriting. And your access to company systems remained intact throughout this period? Mostly. My credentials for the financial platforms were accidentally reset 3 times in the past quarter. IT always apologized for the system glitch and restored access, though the restoration process took progressively longer each time. Daniel was nodding as he scrolled through documents on his tablet. Classic misdirection, creating plausible, technical issues rather than outright revoking permissions that might trigger suspicion or violate corporate governance requirements. What about the board? Madeline asked. I thought you had allies there. I do, or did. The last 2 board meetings were rescheduled at the last minute to conflict with events Richard knew I couldn't miss. Our daughter Emma's college graduation, and that renewable energy conference in Copenhagen where I was delivering the keynote address. Victor's expression darkened. Deliberate isolation from governance oversight. When was the last board meeting you attended? 4 months ago. The minutes from subsequent meetings show unanimous approval for initiatives I would have certainly questioned, including the Westlake acquisition Richard mentioned yesterday. Daniel made a note. We'll need to examine the Westlake deal closely. Inflated acquisition prices often indicate hidden financial arrangements or kickbacks. "What about your children?" Madeline asked softly. "Have they noticed anything?" The question hit a tender spot. Emma, Tyler, and Sophia, 22, 20, and 18 respectively, had been gradually pulled into Richard's orbit over the past year. Weekend visits to his office, impromptu dinners where I was told afterward, "It was just business stuff, Mom. You would have been bored." Caroline arranging internships and connections that positioned Richard as the parent advancing their professional futures. Richard has been cultivating their professional admiration, I admitted, positioning himself as their gateway to career opportunities while framing my contributions as focused primarily on their home life and emotional support. "Divide and conquer extends to the family," Victor observed, "creating a narrative where his business acumen is separated from your domestic contributions, despite your equal role in building Meridian." Exactly. I pulled out my phone, showing them the text from Richard that had arrived during my drive. "Meeting with Emma for coffee to discuss her job options. Might mention our situation. Better she hears from me directly." Madeline's expression tightened with anger. "He's not wasting any time reshaping the narrative with your children." "I've always handled the difficult conversations," I said. "School, troubles, relationship breakups, health concerns." Richard specialized in career guidance and financial advice. He's leveraging their expectation that he handles the business aspects of family life. Victor cleared his throat. "I don't mean to be insensitive, but we need to focus on immediate legal strategy. Richard has clearly been planning this for months. We need to move quickly to prevent further corporate asset manipulation." "Where do we start?" I asked. "Injunctive relief," Victor replied immediately. "We file for emergency judicial intervention to freeze any further corporate restructuring pending investigation of potential breaches of fiduciary duty. We also need to formally document your founding role and ongoing contributions to Meridian Technologies." Daniel was already typing rapidly. "I'm identifying the most problematic transactions for immediate forensic analysis. The Westlake acquisition, the patent reassignments, and these offshore banking arrangements are particularly concerning." "What about Caroline?" Madeline asked. "She's been facilitating this corporate theft while sleeping with your husband. There must be professional consequences." "One battle at a time," Victor cautioned. "We focus first on protecting Julia's interests in the company. Personal matters can be addressed once the business assets are secured." I shook my head. "They're not separate issues. Richard is using the same playbook in both arenas, rewriting history to minimize my contributions, isolating me from decision-making, creating documentation that supports his revisionist narrative. Caroline isn't just his romantic partner. She's actively participating in corporate malfeasance." Victor considered this. "You have evidence of her direct involvement in questionable business practices?" I produced the encrypted drive. Email threads where she discusses restructuring shareholder agreements with outside counsel without board approval. Calendar entries for meetings with patent attorneys where my intellectual property was reassigned without my knowledge. Documentation she prepared for the Westlake acquisition with 2 different purchase price projections, one for the board and another for the actual transaction. Daniel's eyebrows rose as he reviewed the files. "This goes beyond inappropriate delegation. She's functioning as an unofficial corporate officer while circumventing governance protocols. Which means," Victor said thoughtfully, "we can potentially include her in any legal action regarding breach of fiduciary responsibility, even without officer status. Her knowledge of and participation in efforts to undermine proper corporate governance makes her legally exposed." A notification appeared on my phone. Richard again. "Emma mentioned you seemed distressed yesterday. I explained we're working through some business restructuring that might affect our personal arrangements. She understands these things happen in corporate marriages." The calculated phrasing, "corporate marriages," was pure Richard, already recasting our relationship as a business arrangement that had reached its natural conclusion. "He's moving." "Faster than we expected," I said, showing them the message. Victor nodded grimly. "Then so must we. I'll have the emergency injunction paperwork filed within 2 hours. Daniel, how quickly can you produce a preliminary forensic analysis of the most egregious financial manipulations?" "Give me until tomorrow morning for the top 3 transactions. Comprehensive analysis will take longer, but we can establish a pattern of deliberate misconduct with the Westlake deal alone." "What about me?" Madeline asked. "How can I help?" I squeezed her hand gratefully. "Richard expects me to be emotionally incapacitated, reaching out to friends for sympathy and support rather than taking strategic action. I need you to maintain that impression if he contacts you. Express shock, offer comfort, mention I'm staying with you. Whatever reinforces his belief that I'm reacting emotionally rather than strategically." Madeline's expression shifted to understanding. "The underestimation advantage. Keep him thinking. You're crying on my shoulder while you're actually building a legal fortress." Exactly. Richard's greatest vulnerability has always been his tendency to dismiss emotional intelligence as weakness. He won't expect me to move this quickly or decisively. "I need to be completely transparent with the Meridian board," I said, gathering my thoughts as we strategized our next steps. 5 of the 9 directors have worked with Richard and me from the beginning. They deserve to hear directly from me before Richard controls the narrative. Victor looked concerned. "Contacting them might alert Richard to our strategy. Are you certain they'll maintain confidentiality?" "Not all of them," I admitted. "But Elaine Winters and Michael Takahashi will. They were our first investors when Meridian was still operating from our converted garage. They've witnessed my contributions from day one." Daniel nodded, still analyzing financial records on his tablet. "Strategic disclosure to select board members could help establish your ongoing governance role. Just be cautious about putting anything in writing that might give Richard advance warning of legal action." "I'll invite them for brunch tomorrow," I decided. Position it as seeking their counsel during a difficult personal time rather than explicitly discussing legal strategy. Victor began outlining immediate action items while I sent carefully worded text messages to Elaine and Michael. Both responded within minutes, agreeing to meet at Elaine's home the following morning. Their quick responses reinforced my belief that they might have harbored their own concerns about recent company developments. "What about your office at Meridian?" Madeline asked. "Is there anything there you need to secure before Richard restricts your access?" The question sparked immediate concern. My office contained 15 years of documentation, design specifications, and personal items that chronicled my journey with the company. While I maintained digital copies of critical work, the physical evidence of my contributions remained vulnerable. I should go there today, I realized. Richard wouldn't expect me to show up on a Saturday, especially after last night's confrontation. He'll be occupied with damage control with Emma and probably meeting with his attorneys. Victor checked his watch. "If you're going, go now. Take only what's irreplaceable and legally significant. I'll have my associate meet you there to witness and document everything you remove. That prevents later accusations of improper removal of company property." While Victor arranged for his associate to meet me, I changed into more casual clothing. From the emergency wardrobe I kept at Madeline's office across the hall. The transformation from formal suit to jeans and a sweater felt symbolic, shedding the perfect corporate wife persona Richard had expected me to maintain. 40 minutes. Later, I pulled into Meridian's underground parking garage, relieved to see Richard's reserved space empty. The security guard, Ramon, who'd been with us for over a decade, seemed surprised to see me on a weekend but waved me through with a friendly greeting. "Mrs. Mercer, didn't expect to see you today. Mr. Mercer mentioned you were taking some personal time." Of course he had. Already laying groundwork for my diminished role. "Just picking up a few things for a project I'm working on," I replied with practiced ease. My assistant should be arriving shortly. Anita from Victor Chen's office. Please send her up when she arrives. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave me a moment to center myself. I'd helped design this building 7 years ago when we'd outgrown our previous headquarters. The architectural elements reflected my aesthetic vision. Open collaborative spaces balanced with privacy, natural light maximized throughout, sustainable materials selected for both function and beauty. Now it felt like visiting a home where I no longer belonged, though my fingerprints remained on every surface. The executive floor was deserted except for the gentle hum of the climate control system. I used my keycard to access my office, then paused at the threshold. Something felt different. The space appeared untouched, family photos still arranged. On the credenza, design awards displayed on shelves, the ergonomic chair positioned exactly as I preferred. Yet an indefinable sense of violation lingered in the air. Moving methodically, I began gathering essential items, original sketches of our first product line, handwritten notes from breakthrough development sessions, congratulatory cards from clients expressing gratitude for innovations I'd spearheaded. Each item represented tangible evidence of my integral role in Meridian's success. The file cabinet containing my personal research journals appeared undisturbed, but when I pulled open the drawer, I immediately noticed gaps where specific notebooks should have been. My documentation of the SyncTech integration, the breakthrough that had transformed Meridian from a promising startup into an industry leader, was missing entirely. A soft knock interrupted my inventory. Victor's associate, Anita Kim, stood in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Mrs. Mercer?" Victor sent me to assist and document. I welcomed her in, explaining my methodical approach to gathering evidence. Several items appear to be missing already. I need to document what's gone as well as what I'm taking. Anita nodded professionally, creating a detailed log as I continued my assessment. The SyncTech journals weren't the only items missing. The original partnership agreement Richard and I had signed before formal incorporation, the document that explicitly outlined our equal contributions and expectations, was absent from its labeled folder. In its place was a photocopy of a different agreement with significantly altered terms, dated 3 years later. "This isn't the original," I told Anita, showing her the substitution. The authentic document specified equal ownership and decision-making authority between Richard and me. "This version positions him as primary founder with me as a contributing partner." Anita photographed the falsified document. "When did you last verify the original was here?" 6 months ago during our annual document audit. I personally confirmed all founding documentation was intact and properly filed. As we continued our inventory, a pattern emerged. Critical evidence of my foundational contributions had been systematically removed or replaced with altered versions that diminished my role. Most troubling was the disappearance of my original technical drawings for the pattern sync algorithm, the innovation that had secured our first major government contract. "Someone has been very thorough," Anita observed as she documented another substitution. "And very selective," I added. "They've targeted documentation that specifically establishes my intellectual contribution and founding authority. Items that merely show my presence, but not my essential role, remain untouched." A noise in the outer office alerted us to someone's arrival. Through the glass partition, I recognized Caroline walking purposefully toward my door, head down as she texted on her phone. She wore casual weekend clothing, but carried her distinctive designer work bag, the one Richard had given her for Christmas, claiming it was a standard gift for all executive support staff. I'd later discovered it was a $4,000 limited edition that no other staff member had received. Caroline looked up, freezing momentarily when she saw me before composing her features into professional neutrality. She knocked lightly on my already open door. "Julia," she said, surprise barely concealed beneath her polite tone. "I didn't expect anyone to be here today." "Evidently," I replied, gesturing to the open file cabinet. "Were you looking for something specific in my office?" Perhaps the original SyncTech documentation or my pattern sync technical specifications. Her expression remained carefully blank, though a slight flush appeared along her neck. I don't know what you mean. Richard asked me to organize some files for Monday's executive committee meeting. On a Saturday? In my office rather than his? How dedicated. Caroline's gaze shifted to Anita, clearly trying to assess the situation. I can come back later if you're busy. That won't be necessary. We've already documented the selectively missing items. I closed the file drawer with deliberate calm. Please inform Richard that removing or altering corporate records constitutes tampering with company documentation. Victor Chen will be addressing this specifically in Monday's filing. The mention of Victor's name and an impending legal filing caused visible discomfort. Caroline clutched her bag tighter, her professional mask slipping momentarily. I'm just doing my job, Julia. Whatever is happening between you and Richard is personal. Removing evidence of my founding role in Meridian is not personal. It's corporate malfeasance. Something your executive assistant position doesn't cover, regardless of your relationship with my husband. We've established quite a pattern at Meridian Technologies, I said to the assembled group in Elaine Winter's sunlit breakfast room. Original documents mysteriously replaced with altered versions. Access permissions quietly restricted. Critical meetings rescheduled to ensure my absence. Elaine, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and one of Silicon Valley's pioneering female venture capitalists, nodded grimly. Beside her, Michael Takahashi's normally jovial expression had hardened into something closer to controlled anger as he reviewed the documentation I'd provided. How long has this been happening, Julia? Michael asked, flipping through photographs of the altered files Anita had documented the previous day. The systematic removal of evidence appears recent, within the last few months, but the groundwork for my corporate erasure has been underway for at least a year. Elaine removed her reading glasses, fixing me with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless entrepreneurs seeking her investment. And yesterday, on your anniversary, Richard simply announced he was leaving for his assistant and presented divorce papers that coincidentally stripped you of your rightful company ownership, while simultaneously meeting with Emma to reshape the narrative with our children, I confirmed. The timing was deliberate, creating personal emotional chaos to distract from the professional theft underway. Michael closed the folder with a decisive snap. I've seen enough. This goes beyond marital discord into corporate governance violation. The board was presented with transaction documentation that appears to have been falsified, particularly regarding the Westlake acquisition. That's our assessment as well, Daniel confirmed. He'd joined us at my request, bringing preliminary findings from his overnight analysis of Meridian's recent financial activities. The Westlake purchase price was inflated by approximately 22%, above market valuation, with the excess directed through a series of shell companies that eventually connect to an offshore account with beneficial ownership that's deliberately obscured. Elaine's expression darkened further. Are you suggesting Richard is embezzling from Meridian? The evidence suggests a complex financial arrangement between Richard, select Westlake executives, and third-party entities established within the past 8 months, Daniel explained. We don't have definitive proof of embezzlement yet, but the transaction structure serves no legitimate business purpose I can identify. And Caroline's involvement? Michael asked. I pulled up the email thread I'd discovered during my late-night investigation. She coordinated the meetings with Westlake, managed document flow between parties, and prepared the 2 different valuation presentations, the accurate one for Richard's eyes only, and the inflated one presented to the board. This young woman has been with the company, 14 months? Elaine asked incredulously. And Richard granted her this level of access to sensitive transactions? Caroline isn't just an ambitious executive assistant, I explained. Her resume omits her previous connection to Westlake. She consulted for their finance department 2 years ago, specifically on valuation models for potential acquisition targets. Michael's eyebrows shot up. That wasn't disclosed during her hiring. Because Richard handled her recruitment personally, bypassing standard HR protocols by classifying her role as executive office appointment, a category he created specifically for this hire. Elaine and Michael exchanged significant looks, the same silent communication I'd witnessed during countless board meetings when they'd identified a problem before others in the room. "Julia," Elaine said carefully, "when did you first suspect Caroline was more than Richard's assistant?" The question pierced deeper than expected. The truth, that I'd ignored mounting evidence of their relationship for months, felt like acknowledging a professional blind spot I shouldn't have permitted. I had concerns about her unusual access and authority from the beginning, but attributed it to Richard's mentorship. The personal relationship. I paused, recalibrating. There were signs: late-night strategy sessions, weekend work emergencies, Richard's sudden interest in fitness classes at the same downtown gym where Caroline trained. But confirmation came only recently when I found correspondence about their shared future, professionally and personally. "And this documentation removal, that happened after you discovered the relationship?" Michael asked. "Almost certainly. It appears Richard and Caroline accelerated their timeline once they realized I was investigating inconsistencies in the Westlake deal." Daniel opened his laptop, turning the screen so everyone could view his analysis. "The most problematic transactions cluster within the past 4 months, with significant acceleration in the past 6 weeks. This suggests a coordinated effort to complete key financial restructuring before some predetermined deadline." The Osaka conference, I realized suddenly. Richard insisted I represent Meridian at the International Tech Summit in Osaka next month, a 2-week commitment that would have me out of the country during the finalization of the Westlake acquisition and the quarterly board meeting. Elaine's expression reflected dawning comprehension. "Creating the perfect opportunity to push through any remaining changes without your knowledge or interference. And likely serve divorce papers while you were overseas," Victor added. "Presenting the corporate restructuring as a fait accompli while you were thousands of miles away from your support system and relevant documentation. The calculated cruelty of the plan, isolating me professionally and personally before delivering the final blow, momentarily overwhelmed my carefully maintained composure. Madeline, sensing my distress, discreetly passed me a glass of water." "What's our next move?" Michael asked, directing the question to Victor while giving me a moment to recover. "2 parallel tracks," Victor replied. "First, emergency injunctive relief to prevent further corporate restructuring or document removal, which we'll file tomorrow morning when the courts open. Second, formal notification to the full board regarding potential governance violations and financial improprieties. I can call an emergency board meeting as audit committee chair," Michael offered. "We need 7 days' notice per the bylaws, but I can frame it as routine supervisory oversight rather than specific investigation. That prevents Richard from preparing too thoroughly." "What about the children?" Elaine asked gently, addressing me directly. "Richard's already started influencing their perspective. They should hear your side." The question brought fresh pain. Emma had sent a text that morning, carefully worded and clearly influenced by her conversation with Richard. "Dad explained you're having differences about company direction. Hope you can both work it out professionally." The detached language, so unlike my emotionally intuitive daughter, revealed Richard's narrative framing at work. "I'm meeting them for dinner tonight," I said. "All 3 together. Richard has scheduled individual conversations to control information flow, but I insisted on speaking with them simultaneously to ensure consistency." "Will Richard be there?" Madeline asked. "No. He'll try to paint that as my attempt to exclude him, but I need to speak with them directly without his narrative management." Elaine reached across the table to cover my hand with hers. "Trust your relationship with your children, Julia. They know who you are beyond whatever story Richard is crafting." "I hope so," I whispered. "But they've grown up seeing their father celebrated as a visionary tech leader, while my contributions remained largely behind the scenes. Richard has systematically positioned himself as the public face of Meridian, while I focused on product, development, and organizational infrastructure. Then help them understand that dynamic, Michael suggested. Not as an accusation against Richard, but as context for how your complementary skills built something extraordinary together, and remind them that the parent who seeks to alienate children from the other rarely has anyone's best interests at heart, but their own. Elaine added, with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed countless corporate divorces and their personal aftermath. The conversation shifted to tactical details: timing of filings, evidence preservation, communication strategy with remaining board members. Daniel continued sharing financial insights while Victor outlined legal approaches, each bringing their professional expertise to this unexpected battleground. As we finalized immediate action items, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. I excused myself to answer in Elaine's study, finding myself speaking with Raj Kapoor, Meridian's chief technology officer, and someone I considered a reliable ally. "Julia, I'm calling from my personal phone," he began without preamble, his voice tight with tension. "Something's happening at the office. Richard called an emergency leadership meeting for this afternoon. Only certain executives were invited. I only know because Diane in operations mentioned it. My official calendar shows nothing." "Did Diane say who was included?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "The CFO, general counsel, head of sales. Basically everyone who reports directly to Richard rather than to the broader executive committee. Julia." Raj hesitated. "They're gathering in the boardroom, but I saw them bringing in document shredding bins. The industrial kind." The implication was clear. Evidence destruction had begun. Whatever timeline Richard and Caroline had established, my visit to the office yesterday had accelerated their plans. "Raj, can you get into the building without being noticed?" "Already here. Came in to catch up on project reviews." "I'm in my office, door closed. I need you to document everything. Take photos, note who enters and leaves, record times. Can you access the security camera feeds?" "Not without leaving digital fingerprints that could be traced. But I can position my laptop camera toward my door, which gives a partial view of the hallway leading to the boardroom." "Perfect. Send everything to this secure email address." I provided Victor's encrypted system details. "And Raj, thank you for taking this risk." "Meridian is as much yours as Richard's," he replied firmly. "Everyone who's been here from the early days knows that. Whatever's happening isn't right." I ended the call and returned to the breakfast room, interrupting the ongoing strategy discussion with this critical development. "Richard's destroying evidence right now," I announced. "Emergency leadership meeting with industrial shredders brought in on a Sunday." Victor immediately pulled out his phone. "This changes our timeline. We need to file for the injunction today under emergency provisions. Judge Watkins is on weekend rotation. He might grant immediate relief given active document destruction. We need to preserve whatever's left," Daniel added. "Do we have anyone else inside who can help?" I thought quickly about loyalties among the Meridian team. "Possibly. Let me make some calls." I sat in Elaine's living room, making rapid-fire calls to trusted Meridian employees while Victor worked his legal connections to reach Judge Watkins. 20 years of relationship building was proving invaluable. 3 additional employees had agreed to document the unusual Sunday activities without raising suspicion. My executive assistant, Priya, had accessed the cloud backup system remotely, preserving digital copies of files that might already be physically destroyed. "Julia," Daniel called from the dining room, "you need to see this." I joined him at the table where his laptop displayed a complex financial diagram. "What am I looking at?" "Bank records from the Cayman entity connected to Richard's offshore accounts. Look at the transaction dates." The pattern was immediately obvious. Major deposits into the offshore account aligned perfectly with key milestones in Richard's relationship with Caroline. The first substantial transfer occurred the week after she was hired. Another larger deposit coincided with her promotion to executive assistant. The largest transfer of all had processed just yesterday, the day Richard announced, "Our marriage was over." "He's been paying her," I said, the realization landing like a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated business arrangement. Daniel nodded grimly. The payment schedule suggests performance bonuses tied to specific objectives. Yesterday's transfer, $2.3 million, indicates she successfully completed whatever their ultimate goal entailed. Serving as witness and assistant in orchestrating my removal from both marriage and company, I concluded. Richard always did believe in incentive-based compensation. The bitter insight was interrupted by Madeline rushing in with her tablet. "You need to see this. Caroline just posted on Instagram." The image showed a champagne toast, Caroline's perfectly manicured hand bearing an enormous diamond ring alongside Richard's distinctive watch, the limited edition Patek Philippe Citoyen, given him for our 15th anniversary. The caption read only, "New beginnings deserve proper celebration. Future is bright." "She's not even trying to be discreet anymore," Madeline said indignantly. "Because they believe they've won," I replied, feeling a strange calm descend. Richard thinks everything is proceeding according to plan. His documents are in order, the divorce papers are prepared, key evidence is being destroyed, and he's controlling the narrative with our children. From his perspective, I'm still the blindsided wife struggling to process betrayal, while in reality, you're building a legal case that will destroy their entire scheme, Elaine observed with grim satisfaction. My phone rang. Raj again. "Julia, they're moving faster than expected. The shredding is extensive, and Richard just announced a special board meeting has been called for tomorrow morning. He's invoking emergency provisions to bypass the standard notice period." On what grounds? Urgent financial opportunity requiring immediate action. He's presenting the Westlake acquisition closing as time-sensitive, claiming the sellers have another offer if we don't finalize by Tuesday. "That's completely fabricated," I said. "The Westlake owners signed an exclusivity agreement through the end of the quarter. Apparently there's new paperwork showing the exclusivity period ends this week, backdated documentation from what I overhear. Who's supporting this emergency session?" 3 board members have already confirmed attendance: Lawson, Baker, and Griffith. The 3 newest additions to our board, each personally recruited by Richard within the past 2 years, each owing their lucrative board positions to his direct advocacy. What time tomorrow? 8 a.m. Richard's calling it a special executive session, language that technically doesn't require your presence as a non-officer. "Except I'm a founder and major shareholder," I countered. "Excluding me violates multiple governance provisions. Know that. You know that. But Richard's counsel is arguing that since you hold no official C-suite title, you're not required for emergency financial transactions." I thanked Raj and relayed this development to the room. Victor looked up from his phone conversation, clearly processing this new complication as he continued speaking with Judge's clerk. "Richard's accelerating everything," I explained. "Emergency. Board meeting tomorrow morning to approve the Westlake deal before we can act." Michael immediately pulled out his phone. "I'll contact the other long-standing board members. If enough of us refuse to attend, they won't have quorum." "They've thought of that," I replied. "Richard's counsel is arguing that as non-officer shareholders, neither Michael nor I must be included for this special executive session, a distinction that doesn't actually exist in our governance documents, but creates enough procedural confusion to proceed regardless." Elaine's expression hardened. "They're rewriting corporate governance on the fly, counting on the newer board members not knowing better." Victor ended his call with a decisive tap. "Judge Watkins will see us at his home in Bellevue in 1 hour. He's concerned about the active document destruction and potential emergency governance manipulation." The next hour passed in coordinated chaos: document preparation, evidence organization, and strategic planning. As Madeline drove me to the judge's residence, My phone lit up with a message from Richard. Dinner with the children rescheduled. They're coming to the house at 7. We'll discuss our situation together. More appropriate than separate conversations that might create confusion. The control tactic was transparent, undermining my planned dinner with a united front presentation, where Richard could monitor and manage the children's responses. I texted Emma directly. Original dinner plans with you 3 still on. 6 p.m. at Giovanni's. Important we talk privately first. Her response came quickly. Dad says it's better if you're both there to explain things. Avoids miscommunication. Richard had already convinced them that separate conversations with me would constitute miscommunication rather than necessary perspective. I tried a different approach. 20 years together deserves individual conversations too. Please give me this. Time with you 3 first. Dad will have plenty of opportunity to share his perspective. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before her response arrived. We'll be there, but only for an hour, then we promised Dad we'd meet him after. Small victory, but significant. I had 60 minutes to counteract whatever narrative. Richard had already established Judge Watkins' elegant colonial home projected stability and tradition, fitting for a jurist known for his protection of established legal principles. Inside, his wood-paneled study became an impromptu courtroom where Victor presented our emergency petition. The judge, silver-haired and bow-tied even on a Sunday, reviewed our evidence with methodical precision, asking pointed questions about document destruction, governance manipulation, and financial improprieties. His expression remained neutral, but his questions grew increasingly focused as the presentation continued. Mrs. Mercer, he finally addressed me directly. What specific emergency relief are you seeking today? 3 immediate actions, Your Honor, I replied. First, an injunction prohibiting further document destruction or alteration at Meridian Technologies. Second, a temporary freeze on the Westlake acquisition pending investigation of potential financial irregularities. Third, explicit confirmation that any board meeting requires my presence and participation as co-founder and major shareholder, per Meridian's original governance documents. Judge Watkins considered this, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The evidence suggests coordinated efforts to alter corporate records, manipulate governance procedures, and potentially misappropriate company assets. While the underlying matrimonial dispute is not my concern, the corporate governance violations warrant immediate intervention. He turned to his clerk who had accompanied him. Prepare an emergency injunction prohibiting document destruction, temporarily staying the Westlake transaction, and explicitly requiring Mrs. Mercer's inclusion in any board proceedings regarding company ownership, asset disposition, or financial restructuring. Victor couldn't quite suppress his satisfied expression. When will this take effect, Your Honor? I'll sign it immediately. You'll have electronic copies within the hour and can serve notice tonight. The judge fixed me with a penetrating gaze. Mrs. Mercer, I'm granting this extraordinary relief based on substantive evidence of improper corporate behavior. I expect this matter to proceed to full hearing within 10 days, where all parties will have complete opportunity to respond. Understood, Your Honor. Thank you. As we left the judge's residence, the weight of the small victory provided momentary buoyancy. The emergency injunction wouldn't solve everything, but it would prevent Richard from executing his most damaging plans before we could mount a full legal response. We need to serve Richard immediately, Victor said as we returned to Madeline's car, before he can complete whatever document destruction is underway. He'll be at the office until at least 5 p.m. based on Raj's updates, I replied. Then likely home to prepare for the manipulated family dinner he tried to orchestrate. I'll have the process server meet him at the house, Victor decided. Maximum psychological impact, served at the marital residence he's trying to claim as his exclusive domain. The strategic thinking resonated with my own instincts. Richard had orchestrated a public humiliation, announcing his departure on our anniversary. Having legal papers served at our home would deliver a clear message that I wouldn't be passively accepting his narrative. "What about the emergency board meeting he's scheduled?" Madeline asked. "The injunction explicitly requires my participation," I explained. "If Richard proceeds without me, he'll be in direct violation of a court order." "He might still try," Victor cautioned. "We should be prepared for continued resistance until the full weight of legal consequences becomes clear to him." My phone buzzed with an update from Priya. R&C leaving office now, taking boxes of documents to car. Photos sent to secure server. Richard was accelerating his timeline again, likely planning to continue document review and potential destruction at home rather than risk further observation at the office. The development created a new urgency around serving the injunction before more evidence disappeared. "Victor, can we redirect the process server to intercept Richard now, rather than waiting until he's home?" Victor immediately placed the call, redirecting the server to Richard's likely route home. The chess game continued, moves and counter-moves based on anticipated behavior patterns developed over decades of intimate knowledge. "Now we focus on your dinner with the children," Madeline said as we headed toward the restaurant. "What's your approach?" I considered the complex dynamics awaiting me. Emma, our oldest, whose analytical mind reflected Richard's strategic thinking paired with my attention to emotional undercurrents. Tyler, our middle child, the peacemaker who hated conflict and would be suffering most from the family fracture. And Sophia, our youngest, whose fierce loyalty could manifest as defensive anger when her sense of security was threatened. Transparency without overwhelming detail, I decided. They deserve honesty about what's happening, but not in a way that forces them to choose sides or process complex corporate malfeasance while dealing with the emotional shock of their parents' separation. "Will you tell them about Caroline?" Madeline asked carefully. "Yes, but as a relevant fact rather than an emotional centerpiece. The affair matters less than Richard's systematic attempts to erase my contributions to both Meridian and our family. Legacy?" As we pulled up to Giovanni's, the family-owned Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated countless milestones over the years, I spotted my children already seated at our regular corner table. The sight of them huddled together, clearly mid-discussion, triggered both profound love and sharp anxiety. Whatever Richard had already told them had created a unified front. Their body language revealed tension and shared concern. "Remember," Madeline said, squeezing my hand before I exited the car, "they know who you are beyond Richard's narrative. Trust the relationship you've built with them." I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the most important meeting of the day. Not with lawyers or judges or board members, but with the three people whose understanding of unfolding events mattered most to my heart, regardless of legal outcomes. The awkward silence that greeted me at our family table spoke volumes. Emma, ever the diplomat, stood to offer a stiff hug while Tyler and Sophia remained seated, their expressions a mixture of confusion and apprehension. I'd arranged their favorite dishes in advance: Sophia's margarita pizza, Tyler's penne alla vodka, Emma's mushroom risotto, comfort foods for an uncomfortable conversation. "Thank you for coming," I began, sliding into my seat. "I know this is difficult and unexpected. Dad says you're having a disagreement about the company," Emma stated, her tone deliberately neutral. At 22, with her newly minted business degree, she had already adopted the corporate language that created distance from messy emotions. "That's one aspect of what's happening," I acknowledged. "But there's more to the situation than a business disagreement." "Are you getting divorced?" Sophia asked bluntly, her 18-year-old directness cutting through pretense. Dad kept using words like transition and new arrangement, but he wouldn't actually say it. I took a breath, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Your father told me yesterday on our anniversary that he wants a divorce. He's been planning this for some time, in coordination with Caroline." "His assistant?" Tyler looked genuinely shocked. At 20, he was the most idealistic of my children. Always. believing in people's better natures. Yes, they've been involved personally for some time, while also working together on company matters that deliberately excluded me. Emma frowned. That's inappropriate professionally, but people's marriages end all the time without it becoming dramatic? I supplied when she hesitated. You're right. Marriages do end. But this situation involves more than your father's personal relationship with Caroline. It includes systematic efforts to remove evidence of my role in founding and building Meridian Technologies. All three looked startled by this specific allegation. I continued carefully. I've discovered that original company documents have been altered or removed, financial transactions have been structured to exclude me, and preparations made to essentially erase my contributions to the company we built together. That doesn't sound like Dad, Tyler protested. He always talks about how you helped at the beginning. Helped, I repeated gently. That's been the narrative for some time, that I helped with a company Richard founded, rather than the reality that we created Meridian together as equal partners. Emma's analytical mind was already processing implications. Is that why you were at the office yesterday? Dad mentioned you'd been there collecting personal items. I was documenting the removal and alteration of company records that established my founding role. Many original documents have disappeared or been replaced with versions that diminish my contributions. Sophia's protective instincts flared. That's messed up. Why would Dad do that? The simplest explanation is financial. If my role is minimized to supportive spouse rather than co-founder and key innovator, it affects how company ownership is valued and divided in a divorce. But that's... Tyler searched for the appropriate word. Fraudulent, Emma finished. Her legal studies terminology precise. If what you're saying is accurate, it is, I confirmed, which is why I've had to take immediate legal action, not to punish your father, but to protect what I helped build. I watched their faces as they processed this information, each according to their nature. Emma calculating implications, Tyler struggling with cognitive dissonance between the father he admired and these troubling allegations, Sophia's expressive, features cycling through confusion, anger, and protective loyalty. Dad said you'd make accusations because you were hurt about Caroline, Emma said carefully. I nodded, acknowledging their father's predictable strategy. That's a natural assumption. Finding out about their relationship was painful, yes, but my concerns about company manipulation began months ago, before I knew about Caroline personally. The documentation I've gathered isn't emotional. It's financial records, altered corporate filings, and evidence of systematic governance exclusion. Can we see this evidence? Emma challenged, her analytical mind requiring proof. Some of it, yes. Other aspects involve complex financial transactions that require forensic expertise to interpret. But I'm not asking you to judge the legal case. That will happen in appropriate forums. Then what do you want from us? Sophia asked, her directness again cutting through. I want you to understand that whatever happens between your father and me legally, nothing changes how much we both love you. And I want you to know that I won't allow your father's narrative that I was merely a supportive spouse rather than an equal builder of Meridian to go unchallenged. Not because of pride, but because it's simply untrue. Tyler, always our most empathetic child, reached for my hand. Mom, this is a lot to process. We just found out yesterday that you guys were having problems. And now there's all this stuff about company documents and legal actions. I know, I acknowledged, squeezing his hand gratefully. And I wouldn't burden you with these details if your father hadn't already begun sharing his perspective. I needed you to hear directly from me. Emma, still processing with her analytical precision, asked, what happens now with the company, with the divorce? Legally, several processes are underway. I've obtained an emergency court order preventing further document destruction and requiring my inclusion in company decisions. Your father has been served with those papers this evening. You already went to court? Sophia looked surprised. That was fast. Your father has been planning this for months. I've had days. When someone is actively destroying evidence, immediate action becomes necessary. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. And what about us? What do you expect from us in all this? The question revealed Richard's influence, positioning me as the parent making emotional demands while he remained reasonable. I chose my words with extreme care. I expect nothing except that you continue to be the thoughtful, intelligent adults you've become. This situation puts immense pressure on you, and that's deeply unfair. I won't ask you to take sides or make judgments about complex corporate matters. I simply ask that you remain open to understanding that there are two very different perspectives on what's happening. Our food arrived, creating a momentary reprieve from the intensity. As we adjusted plates and distributed Parmesan, I observed my children's silent communications, meaningful glances, slight nods, the shorthand of siblings processing shared crisis. There's something I don't understand, Tyler said as we began eating. If you co-founded Meridian, why have we always heard it described as Dad's company? Even in interviews and articles, it's always presented that way. The question pierced precisely to the heart of the narrative discrepancy that had allowed Richard's revisionist history to seem plausible. That's an insightful question, I acknowledged. Early in Meridian's development, we made strategic decisions about public-facing roles. Richard excelled at external representation, media interviews, investor presentations, industry keynotes. I focused on product development, organizational infrastructure, and client relationships. So you chose to stay in the background? Emma asked. Initially, yes. Your father genuinely was better at certain aspects of company leadership, just as I was better at others. We divided responsibilities according to our strengths. That division made sense for Meridian's growth. But it made it easier for him to take credit over time, Sophia observed with her characteristic directness. The narrative shifted gradually, I agreed. What began as pragmatic role division evolved into public perception that Richard was the visionary founder while I was the supportive spouse who helped occasionally. That perception became increasingly normalized, even within the company, as original team members left, and new employees knew only the established narrative. Did you ever challenge this? Emma asked. Not directly. I focused on the work itself rather than who received public recognition for it. Richard and I knew the truth of our partnership, or so I believed. I never imagined he would leverage that public misperception to actually attempt a legal redefinition of my founding role. Tyler looked troubled. But there must be original documents, patents, something that proves your role definitively. There were, I confirmed. Many have now mysteriously disappeared from company files or been replaced with altered versions. That's why you're going to court, Emma concluded, her analytical mind connecting the dots. That's part of it, yes. The other part involves financial transactions designed to shift company value away from structures I would have rightful claim to in a divorce settlement. Our conversation continued through dinner, their questions becoming more specific as their initial shock transformed into focused concern. I answered everything truthfully but carefully, mindful of the delicate balance between informing them and burdening them with details they shouldn't have to process. As our designated hour approached its end, I noticed their collective tension about the transition to their planned meeting with Richard. This artificial division of their attention, manufactured by Richard's insistence on separate conversations, followed immediately by his counter-narrative, created unnecessary stress for them. Before you go, I said as we finished our meal, I want you to know something important. Whatever your father tells you tonight, whatever perspective he offers on our situation, I won't ask you later to report on that conversation or take sides against him. This conflict is between your father and me. It shouldn't become your burden to manage. Sophia's eyes filled unexpectedly. But it already is our burden. Our family is falling apart. I reached across the table to take her hand. The shape of our family is changing, yes, but the love within it doesn't disappear because of that change. Your father loves you. I love you. That remains constant regardless of legal proceedings or corporate disputes. It doesn't feel constant, Tyler said quietly. It feels like everything we thought was solid is suddenly liquid. His metaphor, so characteristic of his poetic nature, captured the disorientation they must be experiencing. The foundation of their understanding of our family was being fundamentally rewritten. I know, I acknowledged. And I'm so sorry you're experiencing this upheaval. If I could have protected you from it, I would have. By staying in a marriage with someone who was cheating on you and undermining your life's work? Emma asked with sudden intensity. That's not protection, Mom. That's sacrifice beyond what anyone should accept. Her unexpected advocacy created a lump in my throat. I would have worked to repair our marriage if that had been possible, I said carefully. But you're right that the professional betrayal alongside the personal one creates a situation that can't be simply overlooked. As they prepared to leave, for their meeting with Richard, each hugged me with varying degrees of intensity, Sophia fiercely, Tyler tenderly, Emma with restrained emotion. The restaurant had emptied around us, the staff discreetly providing privacy for our difficult conversation. We'll get through this, I told them as we parted outside. Not by pretending it isn't painful or complicated, but by facing it together, with honesty. Emma hesitated before joining her siblings in the car. Mom, she said quietly, I interned in the patent department last summer. I saw your name on the original SyncTech architecture documents as primary inventor. Those patents are fundamental to everything Meridian does now. The confirmation that she had independently observed evidence of my founding technical contributions before any document manipulation began provided unexpected validation. Thank you for telling me that, I said simply. I'll look through my materials. From that internship, she continued, I might have kept some reference notes that could be useful. As I watched them drive away toward their meeting with Richard, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, sorrow for their pain, gratitude for their resilience, and a renewed determination to establish truth regardless of how Richard attempted to reshape our shared history. Victor's text arrived moments later. Injunction successfully served. Richard received papers at residence 1845. Process server reports visible agitation. Expect responsive legal action by morning. The battle lines were officially drawn. Whatever narrative Richard presented to our children tonight, whatever corporate maneuvers he attempted tomorrow, the formal legal constraints were now in place. The emergency board meeting couldn't proceed without my participation. Document destruction was now officially prohibited. The Westlake acquisition was temporarily frozen. Most importantly, I had created space for truth to emerge, not through emotional accusations, but through documented evidence and proper legal process. Richard had been counting on overwhelming me with the personal betrayal while quickly executing the professional one. Instead, he now faced resistance on both fronts, with his accelerated timeline derailed by the emergency injunction. I texted Victor back. Next steps? His response came quickly. Prepare for tomorrow's board meeting, 8 a.m. We've shifted from defense to offense. Morning light filtered through the glass walls of Meridian's executive conference room as I entered precisely at 7:45 a.m. Victor accompanied me, his presence conveying the seriousness of our legal position without requiring explicit explanation. Board members were already gathering, Michael and Elaine arriving together, their expressions professionally neutral, but eyes communicating steadfast support. The three newer board members, Lawson, Baker, and Griffith, clustered near the coffee service, their uncomfortable glances in my direction suggesting Richard had already briefed them on his version of events. Richard himself was noticeably absent, though the meeting materials at the head of the table indicated his intended position. Caroline was similarly nowhere to be seen, an appropriate absence given her lack of board status, though I suspected she had helped prepare the presentation materials stacked neatly at each place setting. "Good morning," I greeted the room with practiced composure, taking my customary seat rather than allowing myself to be repositioned as a visitor in the company I co-founded. "I believe we're scheduled to begin at 8. Lawrence Baker, the newest board member and a longtime connection of Richard's from business school, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Julia, we weren't certain you'd be joining us given the circumstances." The circumstances being Richard's attempt to conduct an emergency board meeting without proper notification to all directors? I asked pleasantly. "Or perhaps you're referring to the court order served yesterday evening explicitly requiring my inclusion in any governance proceedings?" The room fell silent as the implications registered. Michael suppressed a smile behind his coffee cup while Elaine arranged her materials with deliberate precision, neither betraying our prior coordination. "I wasn't aware of any court order," Baker replied, clearly uncomfortable. "Then I'm happy to provide clarity," Victor stated, placing copies of Judge Watkins' injunction on the table. "This emergency order prohibits document destruction, stays the Westlake acquisition pending investigation, and explicitly requires Mrs. Mercer's participation in all board proceedings regarding company ownership or financial restructuring." The boardroom door opened as Victor finished speaking, admitting Richard and Meridian's general counsel, Howard Steinman. Richard faltered momentarily upon seeing me before recovering his characteristic confidence. Howard looked significantly more concerned, his eyes darting to the documents Victor had distributed. "Julia," Richard acknowledged with minimal courtesy, "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "Clearly," I replied, "despite the court order served yesterday specifically addressing my inclusion in this meeting." Howard immediately intervened. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess before formally beginning. Richard, may I speak with you privately?" "That won't be necessary, Howard," Richard replied, taking his seat at the head of the table. "We can proceed, as planned. Julia's presence doesn't change the urgent nature of our business this morning." Howard's discomfort visibly increased. "Given the court documents being circulated, I would strongly advise—" "The Westlake acquisition requires immediate attention," Richard interrupted firmly. "The sellers have indicated their exclusivity period ends this week, creating a time-sensitive opportunity we must address today." "Interesting," I commented, opening my portfolio. "I have here the original exclusivity agreement signed by Westlake's principals extending through the end of the quarter. Perhaps you're referring to a different document?" Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Updated terms were negotiated last week. The board materials include the revised agreement, which I notice is dated 3 months ago, despite these urgent changes apparently occurring last week," I observed. An unusual backdating that might interest Judge Watkins given his explicit stay on this transaction pending investigation of potential irregularities. The 3 newer board members exchanged uncomfortable glances while Elaine leaned forward. "Richard, what exactly is happening here? Julia is referencing court orders and document manipulation. As governance committee chair, I need to understand the situation before we proceed with any vote." Richard's careful composure showed its first significant crack, a momentary flash of calculation behind his eyes as he recalibrated his approach. "There appears to be some confusion stemming from personal matters that have unfortunately spilled into our professional environment. Julia and I are working through marital issues that have created tension around certain business decisions." "By marital issues? Do you mean your relationship with Caroline and your coordinated efforts to remove evidence of my founding role at Meridian?" I asked directly. "Or are you referring to the offshore financial structures established to redirect company assets prior to announcing your divorce plans?" The boardroom fell completely silent. Even Howard, who had been frantically reviewing the court documents, looked up in shock. "These accusations are completely unfounded," Richard declared, his voice controlled but tight. And inappropriate for this forum. I disagree, Michael interjected. As Audit Committee Chair, allegations of financial impropriety and document manipulation fall directly within my oversight responsibilities. Julia, do you have evidence supporting these claims? Victor opened his briefcase, removing a bound presentation that had required most of the night to prepare. We've compiled preliminary documentation of several concerning patterns, he explained, distributing copies to each board member. The first section addresses apparent alteration of founding documents to minimize Mrs. Mercer's role. The second covers unauthorized reassignment of key patents originally registered in Mrs. Mercer's name. The third details financial transactions connected to the Westlake acquisition that raised significant governance concerns. Howard immediately reached for a copy, his legal training compelling him to assess potential corporate liability, despite his close working relationship with Richard. His expression darkened progressively as he turned each page. This is a desperate attempt to leverage a personal disagreement into a corporate governance issue, Richard insisted, though I noticed he made no move to examine the evidence himself, AI telling detail that wasn't lost on the observant Elaine. You haven't even looked at the documentation, Richard, she noted pointedly. That seems an unusual response to serious allegations. Because they're obviously retaliatory fabrications, he replied dismissively. Julia is understandably upset about our marital situation and is attempting to create professional complications in response. The financial records came directly from Meridian's secure server, I stated calmly. The patent reassignment documentation was pulled from official USPTO filings. The altered corporate records were photographed in the company's own files. These aren't fabrications. They're official company documents showing a systematic pattern of governance manipulation. Richard finally reached for the bound presentation, though his expression revealed no surprise at its contents, only calculation about how to respond. Howard, meanwhile, had pulled Richard's chief financial officer into a whispered conversation by the window, their expressions increasingly concerned. Even if there were administrative oversights in documentation, Richard conceded without admitting any specific issue, they don't change the urgent nature of our business today. The Westlake acquisition requires immediate board action. That transaction has been explicitly stayed by court order, Victor reminded everyone. Any vote to proceed would place each board member in potential legal jeopardy for knowing violation of a judicial directive. Teresa Griffith, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. As the newest board member, I'm deeply concerned by what I'm seeing. These patent reassignments in particular seem highly irregular. Mrs. Mercer is listed as lead inventor on Cornerstone intellectual property that now apparently has been transferred to shell companies without board notification or approval. Administrative. Reorganization of intellectual property is routine, Richard attempted, though his explanation lacked his usual confidence. Not without inventor consent, I countered, and certainly not without board approval for assets of this significance. Howard had finished his whispered conference with the CFO, and now addressed the room with the gravity of someone delivering unwelcome legal counsel. In light of these documents and the court order presented, I must advise that we immediately adjourn this meeting without taking action on the Westlake acquisition. The board should reconvene only after legal review of these allegations and proper compliance with the judicial stay. Richard's carefully maintained facade finally showed significant fracture. That's unnecessary and potentially damaging to Meridian's interests. The Westlake integration is time-sensitive. What's damaging to Meridian's interests, Elaine interjected firmly, is continuing to proceed with decision-making under these circumstances. Howard's recommendation is the only appropriate course of action. Michael nodded in agreement. As audit chair, I move that we formally adjourn this meeting and establish an independent committee to investigate these governance concerns before taking any further action on Westlake or any other significant transactions. I second the motion, Elaine added immediately. Richard looked around the table, visibly calculating whether he still commanded enough loyalty to override this procedural maneuver. The newer board members, initially recruited for their presumed allegiance, were now studying the evidence before them with growing concern. All in favor? Michael prompted, initiating the vote before Richard could regain control of the meeting. Hands rose around the table, Elaine and Michael first, followed after brief hesitation by Griffith, then Baker. Lawson glanced anxiously at Richard before finally raising his hand as well. Only Richard's hand remained down, his isolation now complete. "The motion carries," Michael announced formally. "This meeting is adjourned. An independent investigative committee will be formed to review these governance concerns before the board reconvenes." Richard's phone buzzed insistently on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening further at whatever message he'd received. Looking up, he fixed me with a cold stare devoid of the calculated charm he typically deployed. "This won't end well for anyone," he stated quietly. "Especially Meridian. A public governance dispute will devastate market confidence regardless of outcome. That was your choice when you began altering company records rather than acknowledging our shared founding," I replied evenly. "There were countless opportunities to handle both our marriage and our professional partnership with integrity. You chose deception in both." The board members began gathering their materials. The meeting formally concluded, but the tension far from resolved. Howard approached me discreetly as others filed out, his legal caution evident. "Mrs. Mercer, I want to assure you that I had no knowledge of document alterations or unauthorized patent transfers," he said quietly. "As general counsel, I take corporate governance violations extremely seriously." "Then I'll expect your full cooperation with the independent investigation," I replied, "including preservation of any communications regarding the Westlake transaction and recent operational changes to my access protocols." He nodded grimly. "You'll have it. My obligation is to Meridian Technologies, not to any individual executive." As the room emptied, Richard remained seated, his posture rigid with controlled anger. Caroline appeared in the doorway, her expression confused by the meeting's unexpectedly brief conclusion. She carried additional presentation materials, likely the second phase of their planned governance restructuring that now wouldn't occur. "Is everything all right?" she asked Richard, studiously avoiding eye contact with me. "We're adjourned," he replied curtly. "Wait for me in my office." Victor touched my elbow gently, indicating we should depart while our procedural victory was secure. But as we turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped me. "You know this only complicates everything," he said, his tone almost conversational now that others had departed. "A governance investigation, legal proceedings, all creating public spectacle around what could have been handled discreetly." I turned back to face him directly. "Discretion was never your priority, Richard. Control was. You wanted to control the narrative of our marriage ending, just as you've increasingly controlled the narrative of Meridian's founding. But narratives should reflect reality, not replace it. Reality is what people believe it to be," he countered with the same philosophical tone he'd often used during our early strategy discussions. "For years, the market has believed I built Meridian. Most of our current employees believe it. Even our children have largely accepted that narrative because it's been consistently reinforced through every public channel. That doesn't make it true. It makes it operational reality," he insisted. "Whatever documents you produce, whatever technical contributions you made in the early days, the Meridian that exists today is widely understood to be my company. Fighting that perception only damages the company itself." His argument contained the same manipulative logic he'd deployed throughout our marriage, positioning his perspective as the only rational approach, defining reality according to his preferred narrative, and suggesting that any challenge would only cause harm to things we both valued. "The company we built deserves honest governance," I replied simply. just as our marriage deserved honest partnership. You compromised both. Caroline appeared in the doorway again, her expression betraying growing anxiety about the unexpected developments. Richard, the executive team is gathered in your office. They're asking questions about the meeting's outcome. The interruption visibly irritated him, a rare public slip in his typically seamless professional persona. Tell them I'll brief them. Shortly. Caroline hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with my presence. Also, your attorney has called 3 times in the past 20 minutes. He says it's urgent regarding the court filing. This information seemed to refocus Richard's attention. He gathered his materials with renewed purpose, his momentary philosophical reflection replaced by tactical determination. This discussion isn't finished, he told me as he prepared to leave. We still need to resolve both personal and professional matters. I agree, I replied calmly. But resolution requires acknowledgement of actual facts, not convenient narratives. When you're ready for that conversation, I'll be prepared to have it. His only response was a tightening of his jaw before he departed. With Caroline following closely behind, her designer heels clicking a nervous rhythm on the hardwood floor. Victor waited until they were well out of earshot before speaking. First round accomplished. The Independent Investigation Committee will prevent immediate governance manipulation while we prepare for comprehensive legal action. I nodded, feeling the momentary relief of the tactical victory alongside awareness of the longer battle ahead. Richard won't concede easily. He'll be formulating countermeasures already. Undoubtedly. But his position is fundamentally weaker than he realizes. Document alteration, unauthorized patent transfers, potential financial misconduct, these aren't merely marital disagreements. They're governance violations with serious legal implications. As we exited the boardroom, I noticed Emma standing near the reception area, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. Seeing her there, in the company space where this corporate drama was unfolding alongside our family crisis, momentarily disoriented me. "Mom," she said, approaching quickly, "I need to talk to you." "Emma, what are you doing here? Is everything all right?" She glanced nervously toward Richard's office where voices could be heard through the partially open door. "Not here. Can we go somewhere private?" I guided Emma to my office, quickly closing the door behind us. The tension in her shoulders was evident as she placed her laptop on my desk. "I couldn't sleep after dinner last night," she said, opening a folder. "So I went through my internship materials like I mentioned. Mom, I found copies of the original patent applications for the SyncTech algorithms, with your name listed as primary inventor. And there's more." She turned the screen toward me, revealing scanned documents from her summer in the patent department. Original incorporation papers, early technical specifications in my handwriting, and most critically, emails between Richard and the patent. Attorneys from 6 months ago discussing the administrative reassignment of intellectual property. "Dad told us last night that your contributions were supportive but not foundational," Emma continued, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "He said you were trying to claim credit for technical innovations you didn't create, but that's not what these documents show." The evidence Emma had preserved, innocently, during her internship before any of this began, provided the authentication we needed for the altered records we'd discovered. Her independent documentation created an unimpeachable timeline of Richard's systematic erasure attempts. "I need to do the right thing," she said firmly. "These belong in the company records, not hidden away." Victor, who had remained respectfully silent, spoke gently. "Emma, this is tremendously important evidence. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about when and how you obtained these documents?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes. Dad's been lying, to the company, to us, to himself. I can't stand by and watch that." A gentle knock interrupted us as Elaine appeared in the doorway. "Julia, the executive team is asking for guidance. Richard has apparently left the building with Caroline." Victor checked his phone. My office confirms Richard's attorney has filed emergency motions attempting to vacate Judge Watkins's order. They've been assigned to Judge Crawford for review this afternoon. The company needed stability during this leadership crisis, regardless of my personal situation. Elaine, can you call an emergency executive session? The leadership team deserves transparency about what's happening. As Elaine departed to arrange the meeting, Emma touched my arm. Mom, there's something else. Tyler and Sophia are at home packing your things. Dad told us last night he's changing the security codes today, and that you'd agreed to move out immediately. Another manipulation. Using our children as unwitting accomplices in my displacement from our home while creating a narrative that I had consented to the arrangement. That's absolutely untrue, I assured her. There's been no such agreement. We figured, Emma replied with a sad smile. That's why they're only packing your personal items and important documents, not actually moving anything out. Sophia said, and I quote, "If Dad wants Mom's stuff moved, he can hire movers like a normal divorcing person instead of making his children do his dirty work." A laugh escaped me despite everything, Sophia's fierce practicality cutting through Richard's manipulations. The next few hours passed in focused activity, meeting with the executive team to provide appropriate transparency, documenting Emma's evidence, and coordinating with Victor on our legal response to Richard's emergency motions. By late afternoon, Judge Crawford had not only maintained the original injunction, but expanded it to explicitly prohibit any changes to residents' access or security without mutual agreement. Richard's overreach had only strengthened our legal position. As day faded into evening, I found myself standing in my office, looking out at the Seattle skyline, the same view I'd shared with Richard when we designed this building together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in this unexpected battle, but today had revealed something essential that Richard had failed to anticipate. The truth was never just a narrative to be controlled. It existed in documents, in patents, in the institutional knowledge of longtime colleagues, and in the memory and understanding of our children. Richard's careful construction of his preferred reality was collapsing, not because of my opposition, but because reality itself resisted his revision. On our anniversary, Richard had announced he was leaving for his secretary, believing he controlled both the personal and professional narrative. Instead, he'd triggered the revelation of who really built his business, and perhaps more importantly, who our children had grown to become. Adults capable of recognizing truth even when it came, wrapped in painful circumstances.